Cuba has an interesting pre-Columbian era. It was colonized as early as 3000 BC. The oldest known Cuban archaeological site, La Visa, dates from approximately 3100 BCE. More sites in western Cuba date to 2000 years before Christ, or before Common Era, BCE. Neolithic cultures. These Neolithic cultures utilized ground stone and shell tools and ornaments and lived a subsistence lifestyle. So they made their own stone tools, they made tools out of shells, and they lived on fishing, hunting, and collecting wild plants and animals. Prior to Columbus's arrival, waves of migrants, including the people pictured here, the Taino and the Siboney. This is actually a South American tribe, but the people would look very similar to this. They're called the Arawak people, lived in Cuba. These people migrated along the eastern borders of South America and came into the Caribbean. So if we think back to the waves of human migration, we would say that about 40 to 60,000 years ago would have crossed over the Bering Strait, came down into Canada. They were trapped there in an ice age for 10,000 plus years. They would have made it into the United States, depending on the estimates. We're continuing to find more and more information that pushes those dates back. Back when I was studying, it was clear that it was 10 to 16,000 years. They're now finding sites as old as 25 to 30,000 years. So it continues to push back the dates. So they would have come through the United States, gone into Mexico, and we would have successive waves of cultures that would have come through over the past 10,000 years. They would have entered into South America, gone all the way down to the tip of South America, and then realized they couldn't go any further, started going back up again to fill in the space. So as they came up against this eastern border, they would have come into the Caribbean. They would have gone on their ships and sailed out into the Caribbean. So this same group of people, bearing the same DNA traits, came from South America and traveled across the Caribbean. The Taino population of Cuba had reached 350,000 by the end of the 15th century. So consider how good life must have been for them, that on this island, of Cuba, that they had 350,000 people there. And that was approximately the amount of people that the Spaniards killed when they arrived. They cultivated yucca, cotton, tobacco, corn, sweet potatoes, and they really had everything that they needed to live a fruitful life and to sustain their culture and their beliefs. And then comes the Spanish. Christopher Columbus, on his first voyage to the Caribbean, seeking the Americas in 1492, sailed south from what is now the Bahamas to explore the northeast coast of Cuba and the northern coast of Hispaniola. Columbus, who was searching for a route to India, believed that Cuba was the peninsula of the Asian mainland. And shortly after Columbus retired from his career as a navigator, he took a job as a part-time television weatherman. And I apologize to any meteorologists out there. I actually did that joke once, and sitting right in the front row was a meteorologist. He told me afterwards he had a great sense of humor, but we had a good laugh at it. So during his second voyage in 1494, Columbus passed along the southern coast of the island, including points of what is now called Guantanamo Bay. Pope Alexander VI commanded Spain to conquer, colonize, and convert the pagans of the New World to Catholicism. But that proved to be too much. So they decided instead simply to decimate these people. It was clear to them that there was not going to be any level of conversion. The languages were too different. They simply were not going to be a people that would be held or enslaved, nor would they be colonized. So consequently, Spain felt that the only choice that they had really was to decimate these people. The Spanish settled Hispaniola, what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. In 1511, they established the first Spanish settlement, Baracoa, in Cuba, with orders from Spain to conquer the island. The local Taino population, the local native population, was led by a chieftain by the name of Hatui. And Hatui had arrived in Cuba after leaving Hispaniola because of the Spanish. So, the Spanish arrive on his island. He's chief there. They basically push him off of his island. He comes to Cuba. and what happens? The Spain show up next in Cuba. So the poor guy couldn't get away from them. He continued to offer resistance, training people, training warriors, and fighting himself, trying to build a resistance to the Spanish colonists, but successive chieftains as well as Hatui were captured and burnt alive with orders from the Pope. Within 3 years, the Spanish had gained control of the island. In 1514, a settlement was founded in what was to become Havana. The Spaniards massacred large numbers of natives. In fact, according to one account, over 3,000 people turned out with food, without any weapons of any kind, with bread, with fish, with fruits and vegetables, to welcome the Spaniards, and by most accounts, they were all killed. The surviving indigenous groups that heard about the slaughters decided that they were not going to come close anymore, so they abandoned their villages, went into the mountains. Many went to the same mountains that later on Fidel Castro and Raul and Che Guevara would flee to, the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and they were often captured and forced into reservations. But many of them continued the resistance for many years, until, of course, the native tribes were decimated by measles and smallpox, and many escaped and lived into the mountains, where they would later insert their DNA. They would mate with the Spanish soldiers later on, and there are still traces today of this Taino DNA from South America, this trace that goes all the way across the Caribbean, but it can still be traced in Cuba today. So the Spanish have now killed off all of the native workforce. So desperate for labor to work the new agricultural settlements, the Spaniards bought slaves from the surrounding islands and the continental mainland. However, many of these new arrivals also escaped into the mountains. So we see even early on, the African slaves that were brought over started to escape into the mountains to commingle with the native population. So we see this intermingling of blood and beliefs even very early on. So there were many unions between the Spanish soldiers as well as the African slaves as well as the Taino, and so similar traces of this DNA are found today in Cuba that can be traced to current Amazonian tribes as well. The local population also left their mark on the language, with over 400 Taino terms and place names surviving to the present day. The name Cuba itself, Havana, Camagüey, and many of these other names were derived from the Taino language. Indigenous words such as tobacco, hurricane, and canoe were also transferred to English and are still used today. The Spanish established tobacco as one of Cuba's primary products, and Cuba soon became the primary base for most of Spain's operations in the Caribbean. Africans were taken from their homelands and made as slaves, and this is an important point to be drawn. Many people say, there were slaves in Africa when they were taken, and that their chieftains gave them. They were not slaves. These were free people. Chieftains in tribal Africa did not regard people as chattel, as something to be owned, and no chieftain had the right to give another person, certainly not to a foreign power. These were people who were convinced one way or another that they would have a better life, and then soon when they realized that they were not going to have a better life, successive slaves, groups of Africans, were simply captured and brought over against their will. So it's important to make that distinction, that they started out as Africans and they were made as slaves. Cuba's access to slaves was restricted over time due to domination by the British, French, and the Dutch. But it was at one point during the 7 Years' War, when the British conquered the port of Havana, that they introduced another large group of African slaves into the market. So it was during this period that they were able to increase the number of slaves. And also, Spain started to take a little bit better care. They started to learn from the British, who took better care of their slaves. Before, they would simply treat their slaves with very little regard, and if they died, they died. When they started to realize that these slaves were fewer in number, they started taking better care of them. They also started a mating program as well, so that they would have more and more people as slaves. So they started to learn. It became a very heinous period in Cuba's history. The Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 saw the arrival of many French refugees fleeing the slave rebellion there. So they had the slave uprising, and these people left, and then they came over to Cuba, and guess what? They were made into slaves there as well. New arrivals brought slaves and expertise in growing sugar and coffee into the Cuba in the 1790s and early 1800s. So, interestingly, it was very much a tobacco land. When the slaves came over, though, they brought with them new knowledge of crops and how to manage the land. So it was largely because of the slaves that they were able to understand that these crops would grow well, so they started introducing sugar, started introducing coffee, in addition to tobacco. In the 19th century, sugar plantations became the most important product of Cuba, and the expansion of slavery and the expansion of sugar technology, refining technology, allowed Cuba to become a real global powerhouse in the production of sugar. The British Slave Trade Act of 1807 abolished the slave trade in the British Empire, but slavery largely remained important and necessary until the Abolition Act of 1833. But believe it or not, they really didn't eliminate slavery. Even though the Abolition Act came in 1833, it wasn't until the late 1800s that they eliminated slavery. And Cubans were torn. On one hand, they understood that slavery was an awful moral, ethical dilemma. They understood that it would tear at the fiber of who they were as a people. And yet, they understood, as many cultures understood before them and after them, the power and the importance of slavery to the success of their products, the success of their businesses. And so they decided in time, by the end of 1800, slavery was effectively abolished in Cuba. Now we'll talk a little bit about the people of Cuba. The culture of Cuba reflects Spanish influences, reflects the Taino influences, African influences, but it also reflects a great number of American influences. From 1901 to 1959, the year of the Revolution, Cuban culture was heavily influenced by the United States. Cubans came to loved all things American. They loved our cars, they loved our music, they loved our sports. Baseball, still today, many Cubans, many of our best baseball players come from the Caribbean islands, from Puerto Rico, from Cuba. They loved everything about American. Matter of fact, if you were going down the Punta Gorda in Cienfuegos and you noticed the architecture, almost all of that was 1950s architecture. It looked like every house was just a replica from the Brady Bunch going up and down that street. But they really loved American architecture from the 1950s and continued to build right up until the Revolution. In some respects, Cubans saw that their culture was more closely aligned to American culture than any other Latin American country. So even though our languages were different, they felt that they were more closely aligned to America than they were with the Dominican Republic and with Mexico, their closest neighbors. During the revolutionary period of after 1959, Cuba was surprisingly declared a communist state. I say that because most people were surprised that when the revolution had completed and that Fidel Castro was in power, that he would align himself with the communists. They did not see this coming. They understood his socialist leanings, but they did not understand the allure of communism. In the United States, we tend to lump communism and socialism together. And it's important to make the distinction that communism is a political ideology. Socialism is an economic ideology. And so the joining of the two at times are very convenient, but they're not necessary. There are many states that are socialist and not communist, but of course almost all communist states are indeed socialist. So it's important to draw that distinction. And the Cuban people understood that they were going to be signing up for, that they were supporting a man who would bring to them a socialist state, but they did not understand that they were walking into a communist trap. The Russian presence was almost immediately felt in Cuba. This presence contributed to a change in Cuba's political ideology, and it included Russian cars. So if you saw all those beautiful American cars, and then you saw the Lavas, the 1960s and early 70s Russian cars, they almost all hate these cars. But they're cheaper, they were efficient, and these Russian engines could actually support some of the 1930s and 1940s cars, American cars, that were a little bit smaller. But when it came to the 1950s cars, our really big, heavy American cars, these sorts of engines wouldn't cut it. So instead they installed diesel engines. So whenever you hear some of those cars starting up, it sounded like you're at a truck stop. It sounded just like a diesel truck coming past. One of the most distinctive parts of Cuban culture is the music and the dancing. How many of you did the overnight to Havana? Quite a few of you. And you went to the Tropicana and were able to see the music and hear the music and see the dancing. It's such a tremendous show. And for those of you who went out on your own to some of the other clubs, you were able to see, too, the importance of music, the importance of dancing in Cuban culture. They don't have a lot of money, but what they do have, they're willing to spend it on nice clothes and on a bottle of rum so they can go out and enjoy an incredible night of dancing. We actually did it ourselves. We actually went to one club in Cienfuegos, which I think is going to be our all-time favorite club now, because most clubs, we're just way too damn old for these things now. Getting back at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning. But this club started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and finished at 9 o'clock at night. I was able to get back, curl up, take a shower, order some room service. It was fantastic. And we still watched a little television for a while. So it was perfect for my wife and I. We're going to keep coming back to that same club. So the origins of much of Cuban music can be found in this mix of Spanish and West African music. And there's also some elements from the United States with the trombones and the trumpets and how they use this music and mix it all together. So you have this wonderful mix of eclectic styles from Spain, from Africa, and from the United States that all comes together to form Cuban music. One thing that you definitely recognized, I'm sure, was how community-focused Cubans are. No matter where you went, you probably saw families out together, you saw people working, you saw, if you walked past their homes, you saw them inside. They're very, very community-focused. They don't have a lot, but what they do have, they dedicate to each other, and they're very connected to each other. This is one of my favorite photos, because you know that woman has just given it to her. It's a common understanding that everyone in Cuba knows everyone else's business. Real privacy is very difficult to find, and that leads us to some basic understandings. In a country that's unable to have a lot of privacy, particularly among the young generation, what are the natural consequences of a lack of privacy? We'll talk about that in a minute. With this loss of privacy comes the advantage of having a very large support network. These are some of the elements of Cuban society that we really long for today. I think when most Americans come over, they say, you know what? For as difficult as many Cubans have it, they have a real joy. There's a real happiness that what they have is a real connectedness to each other and to their communities and to their families, and they take the time to enjoy each other. And these are things that I think we've lost, and we feel that loss demonstrably in our own countries. Appearance, you'll notice that even those who are very poor came out wearing their nice clothes. You won't see many pairs of shoes that are scuffed. They're well polished. Their hair looks good. They're wearing their best shirt. They may not have a lot of clothes, but the clothes that they have, they take very good care of, and they want to make sure that they smell good, that they particularly when they're going out. But when they walk out in the streets, it's very important for them to look good. In fact, there's a Cuban phrase that says that even in hard times, the importance of looking good, smelling good, is more important than actually eating well. Directness. If you had any conversations with Cubans, you knew and recognized quickly that they were very direct people. They didn't shy away from your questions. And this is very interesting because in Latin American countries, those of you who have traveled in Central America and South America, you recognize that they really won't answer a question directly. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite phrases is that in Costa Rica, the no sounds exactly like the word yes. They don't understand how to say no, so you'll ask them, and they won't say no. They'll just continue to say yes, but in a way that leads you to believe that it's not going to happen. And in Cuba, they'll just come straight out and tell you no. And so that's one of those great connections between Americans and Cubans that is not present among other Latin cultures. That we can ask a Cuban a question and they will give us a straight answer, and that's valuable to most Americans, particularly in business. So we tell people that if you're from the East Coast, you're going to love Cubans because they're very direct in the manner of most people from New York. Cubans also love jokes, and they love humor. They're happy to sit and talk and tell you stories and listen to your stories. They also make a great deal of jokes about their hardships. They recognize their hardships. They recognize how difficult their life is, but they don't dwell on the negative aspects. They're much more likely to tell you a joke about their culture and a joke about their hardships than to take it too seriously. So one of my favorite jokes is about Fidel Castro. And this is Fidel Castro when he died. The story goes that he was given two options that he must accept. He had to take 1,000 nights in heaven and 1 night in hell. But he could choose which one he did first. So he chose heaven. He figured, okay, 1,000 years sounds pretty good. I could use a little R&R. So he decided that he was going to go to heaven for 1,000 years. Well, he gets there. Clearly, he doesn't find anyone he knows. So he gets to heaven. Pretty decent food. Scenery was pretty good. A lot of church music. He wasn't really into that. But he thought it was okay. And then the 1,000 years passed very quickly. He leaves heaven after his 1,000-year period. And the devil comes to him and says, okay, Fidel, it's time for your 1 night in hell. Well, as he descends into hell, the first thing he sees, all of his buddies, and he's brought into this beautiful bar, with beautiful dancing girls like it was in the 1950s in Havana. Everyone drinking, having a wonderful time, all the best food, all the things that he couldn't get during his era. He was able to find all this great food. And so he enters after this wonderful night in hell, and God and the devil are standing next to each other. They say, okay, Fidel, which one would you like to choose? And he said, heaven was nice, but I said, I think I'm gonna stick with hell. All of my buddies are there, and it was a wonderful party. I think that's what I'm gonna stick with. And as it goes, the devil said to him, he gets down there, and when he gets back into hell, he realizes it's hellfire and brimstone, and all of his friends are melting, and there's no good food, there's nothing to drink, not an ice cube for miles. And the devil looks at him and he says, Fidel, you should have known better. It's one thing to be a tourist. It's quite another thing to be a resident. If my dad were here, my dad is 93 and he's got a million jokes. I'm waiting for him to integrate that one into his role. In Cuba, the wife takes on the traditional role of housewife and cook, similarly to many cultures around the globe. Interestingly, a growing number of Cuban women are taking on professional jobs. They're becoming doctors and nurses, specialists. Many of them are becoming attorneys. And so we're seeing a real change in Cuban culture, that the women are becoming more educated and much more independent. Women in Cuba tend to be more liberated than in many other Latin countries, while the males tend to be still the main wage earners, because most of the labor that's available in Cuba today is still hard labor. So the men still are the large wage earners. I tell people that Cuban folks are just like most other Latin American people, and particularly the men. The men, of course, always think that they're in charge, right? So the phrase goes that the man is the head of the family, and you'll get agreement with that. The men will all shake their heads, darn right, we're the head of the family. And then my next comment is always that the woman is the neck, and she turns that head any way she wants it to go. And that's very much clear here in Cuba as well. Marriage, we were talking about privacy issues, right? And how privacy would affect the fabric of culture, this lack of privacy. In the 1980s and the early 1990s, approximately 20% of Cubans chose to marry, already a low number. Most married in their 20s. University-educated women tended to get married at an older age and have fewer children. Today, couples marry from the age of 30 to 35 years of age, and the incidence of married men having relationships with unmarried women is very commonplace in the country. And this is what part of the concern is. Divorce rates are now at 70% in Cuba. It is the highest divorce rate of any country in the world. So out of 100 marriages, a full 70 of these marriages will end in divorce. Divorce is a simple process in Cuba. However, the problem is there's not enough houses in Cuba. So you can get divorced and still spend the next 20 to 30 years living under the same roof because you have no place else to go. And so imagine the stress that puts on society. Number one, on a marriage, you've already been divorced, and now you have to live with the same person for the next 25 to 30 years. So housing is so scarce that there's often no place to go. There's also a heavy emphasis on birth control and abortion. Cuba is somewhat pro-choice despite the influence of Catholicism on the moral fabric of the culture. When the Catholic faith was pushed away from Cuba, the abortion issue was really settled by Cubans, and it was legalized. The church has little or no impact on the way women think about abortion. The use of contraceptives, birth control, and other economic forces is really what keeps the size of the family so low. Low birth rates. The birth rates fell from 33.6 per 1,000 in 1966 to one-third of that in 2015. So consider that Cuba, I believe, is labeled incorrectly as a developing nation in the sense that it's really not developing. It's regressive in many respects. So we would take a look at a developing nation, developing third world country, and say it really doesn't follow form. The form for most of these third world countries is they have low levels of birth control, low levels of abortion, high church impact, which reduces birth control, and so there's a very high birth rate. But Cuba was already very, very advanced before the revolution, and consequently what we've seen is this advancement is just becoming a regression. So to call it a developing world really isn't. I think at some point it will be developing again, but right now it's still a country that because of the revolution is in a regressive phase. So why are the birth rates so low? Many people are leaving the island to become U.S. citizens or leaving to go to other countries because they realize that it's not going to get any better and now is the time to leave. Widespread contraception and access to birth control, as well as abortion, makes it easier to not have children. For most couples, there's simply not enough money to even consider having a child. The severe housing shortage, low or almost no economic value for children. They don't see the value today. They used to be that you would have many children to help you work the fields. Most of these people are no longer in the fields anymore. They're all mostly living in the city. So all of the great things that the revolution did for the people who are living in the countryside effectively pushed the majority of them into the cities. And so consequently, there's little or no economic value to having children today. It's just seen as all really a downside. And they really don't believe that things are going to get better. They think that things are going to remain the same or maybe get a little bit worse. And so consequently, they just don't understand the idea of bringing children into a world that's only going to get worse. The housing shortage in Cuba is now estimated at 500,000 homes. Now consider that an average house will have maybe 6 to 12 people, and consider that the total population of the island is 11.2 million. And this number of 500,000 home shortage gives you a very clear idea just how severe the housing shortage is. Castro promised to build 1 million new homes in the revolution, but in the end, he ended up only building 15,000 homes and apartments, Many houses hold several generations, including young couples. So it's not uncommon to find a house that will have a great-grandmother or great-grandfather, grandparents, parents, and then the children, and some of those children with children. There can be upwards of 8 to 12 to 15 people in a 2-room house. Not uncommon. So couples simply have no room to raise a child in a house filled with aging family members, and with little prospects of finding their own home, they're forced to abstain from childbirth. But I say that there's another reason as well. Privacy is pretty important to getting pregnant. And if these young kids can't find any place to be alone, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to engage in the sexual activity that's necessary to have children. And so today what's happening is the doctors are actually encouraging people to have unprotected sex. I'll talk about that in a minute. So couples who are making $20 to $30 a month have little hope to be able to raise a family. This is a typical bedroom in one of the housing areas in Havana. There's almost no hope that the economy can grow, and so consequently they decide there's no sense in having children. Consequently, you see a lot of people just putting the money into the way they look, enjoying their lives and living for the moment, because when you no longer have children, your mindset changes. Most of you are here in your senior years because you've dedicated your lives to taking care of your children during your working years. If you no longer have children to think about, the way you live also changes. And so consequently, this whole generation is not going to have to worry about saving for their children, putting children through school, worrying about giving them a good start. They can really become more focused on themselves. So even though we think that this millennial generation is very much focused in developed cultures, it's also very much focused here in Cuba as well, that this is a generation that if you go out to the clubs are taking selfies of themselves, 5 and 10 at a time, testing out their new looks. No matter where you go, this idea of the cell phone and the selfie generation holds true, and it holds true definitely in Cuba. As I mentioned, part of the government campaign now is to encourage younger kids who are in their late teens and 20s to actually have unprotected sex, so that they'll have more children to continue to fuel the revolution. Now, aside from obviously increasing the birth rate, imagine, however, the dangers that this puts people in for the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. Particularly at a time now when the Cuban economy is opening up to tourism, and people with diseases that haven't been in Cuba before, they've been isolated, will now make their way into the country, and this kind of a decision by the government, in my estimation, is reckless. Now we'll talk a little bit about traditions. In 1968, Fidel Castro banned Christmas in Cuba. And the reason for it, he said, was that they needed more time. The macheteros who were out cutting sugarcane needed more time, and they needed more people, so they gave it off as a holiday, but that they couldn't take it as a holiday anymore because they needed to be out working. Well, the real reason was that obviously the Catholic Church said that being a Catholic is incompatible with being a communist. And so Fidel Castro then said, well, then being a communist is incompatible with being a Catholic. And so consequently, we're simply going to ban Christmas. We're going to ban many of the religious holidays. And we're going to ban Catholics from holding any of the top positions in the Communist Party, which were the best paying positions. So if you were a Catholic, it was ostensibly like being unemployed or being at the lowest end of the work spectrum. So on Christmas, they didn't have much of a celebration for 3 or 4 decades. But New Year's was their big holiday. So on New Year's, they would take their old clothes from the past year. They would wipe all of their bad energy, all the negativity of the past year. They would stuff it with hay, and they would put these dolls out on the street. And then at New Year's Eve, they would burn this huge fire. So they would burn all of their past problems, all of their negativity. And then the next day, they would put on their brand new clothes and start a brand new year with a new life and a new positive outlook. Fireworks displays are also very common on New Year's. For 28 years, Christmas was banned in Cuba. And you'll see here, this is one of the few photos you'll ever see with Fidel Castro wearing a suit. It wasn't until Pope John Paul II visited Cuba in 1997 that Castro reinstated Christmas as a national holiday. Some people say that it was actually one of the conditions that Pope John Paul II visit Cuba was that they reinstate Christmas as a national holiday. At Christmas, large numbers of family gather for a Christmas meal. Now, I'm not talking about you folks or my family, when we say, we had a big Christmas here, there were 10 people. This is a big Christmas when 150 people show up. So 150, 200 people, all of their relatives come. They all contribute to buying a pig, having this pig butchered 2 days before. They put it over the barbecue, and so they make their sweet sticky buns, their Cuban breads, their desserts, their puddings, and this becomes a huge celebration for the entire family. And if you have a small family, they'll probably invite your family along into. It's just a very welcoming celebration. Desserts are passed on from previous generations and are also a big part of the Christmas celebration. The exchange of gifts and belief in Santa Claus are not practiced in Cuba. Can anyone give me a reason why perhaps the idea of Santa Claus is not practiced or accepted in Cuba? Okay, I heard a few out there. You're all wrong. I like the air defense one the best, though. But the no chimneys probably comes in a close second. I'm going to keep those in mind. This could be a couple more jokes, so you're just giving me more material. I just want you to know it's just going to make the lectures longer for the next group of people. No, the reason is because Coca-Cola wasn't introduced in Cuba. And Coca-Cola is responsible for our modern concept of Santa Claus. The dress, everything, that was actually the product of 1950s advertising of Coca-Cola is the creation of Santa Claus. So the very way that Santa Claus dressed today is with the red suit is all because of Coca-Cola. And strangely, at two places I just saw this past week, for the first time in many years that I've been visiting, Coca-Cola is finally now on Cuba. So there were a couple of restaurants that I went to where you could find a Coca-Cola. So very interesting. But that's one of the main reasons. And the gifts is actually a relatively recent phenomenon because they used to practice giving gifts. But then after the revolution, they realized they had nothing to give each other. And so they refrained from giving each other gifts. And instead, they got together with this big community party and started to everyone coming together. So pre-revolution, Cuban culture was a lot like American culture. It was much more about smaller families, maybe a little bit of extended family, but the revolution effectively diminished their resources and forced them to come together as larger communal units, larger familial units. And so socially, this has become a very interesting topic to see how the revolution has shaped cultural practices, but also shaped the significance of family over the past 4 to 6 decades. In Cuba, recipes are not written down. Number one, there's not a lot of paper and pens laying around. But number two, it's something that's passed down through oral tradition. And so they continue to pass down these recipes, and that's what keeps it alive. So it's passed from one generation to the next. And so part of the fear among Cubans is they want to have their independence, but they're also afraid that with this independence, with this new ideals and westernization, that they feel that they may lose what makes them unique and what they really truly love, and that is their connectedness as a family. Birthdays are a wonderful time in Cuba. When you have your birthday, it's not just about inviting a few people. They'll invite your coworkers, your friends, your family. Everyone comes. They have a huge cake. There's a dinner. And they also do a piñata with small toys and candy. So it becomes a very, very big deal. Again, when you don't have a lot to celebrate, when you don't have a lot to celebrate with, you find every opportunity that you possibly can to enjoy the here and the now, to embrace the present moment. Now we'll talk a little bit about life under Castro. Before Castro, there was General Fulgencio Batista, who was once considered a Cuban national hero. But the surest way to ruin being a national hero is to be president, go into retirement in Daytona Beach, and then decide to come back and have a military coup to put you right back in power. Then he went from being a respected national hero to someone who they saw as a despot. So he quietly returned to Cuba seeking power, and in a coup actually suspended the Constitution and took over the government. In tomorrow's lecture, I'll talk more about exactly how this all took place and how that impacted Fidel Castro and his plans for the government. And this is when Castro came into view. So he saw Fulgencio Batista. Fidel Castro at the time was actually wanting to run for a congressional role. Fidel was an attorney. He decided he wanted to make changes the proper way. So he filed lawsuits against Fulgencio Batista. No one was hearing it. He tried to run for public office, but when Fulgencio Batista came into office, he declared that democracy was done and that this was now called disciplined democracy. Disciplined democracy, which means no more elections. And so Fidel Castro was unable to run for public office. And so Fidel said, we can't have this. But in a twist of fate, obviously what ends up happening is Fidel Castro overthrows one dictator and becomes a dictator himself. So he was one of the most vocal opponents of Batista. Just like most war efforts, people collected weapons, ammunition, food, money to help support Fidel Castro and his cause. In fact, the United States did as well. Castro won, but the celebrations were short-lived as they realized that he was a vengeful despot and dictator. From mostly free to mass executions, before Castro came along, Cuba wasn't much different from the United States. Matter of fact, they had more televisions per capita than the United States of America, more telephones in their home than most Americans had. And so they were very much aligned with American culture. So it went from mostly free to, in a very short period of time, the government sponsored televised trials of counter-revolutionaries. So anyone who disagreed with the revolution was effectively taken out of their home, marched out into the street, and killed in the street. And this was done often on televised live television. So people went from having regular television programs to now state-sponsored television with the government now posting and showing these executions from time to time on television. More than 30,000 people were marched from their homes into firing squads. The TV news was the first to air the propaganda. Famous newscasters and commentators were removed from office. Some of them were silenced, some of them sent into labor camps, some of them were killed. Non-Cuban TV shows were eliminated. So any of the American TV shows that they grew up watching, that they grew up loving, were no longer on television anymore. So they created their own versions, I'd like to think, like Fideligan's Island or Murder, She Wrote, something along those lines. I'm still working on some more. If you guys have any ideas for new programs, just send those to me via email. And then Cuba then began to target propaganda at children. Now, I mentioned to you how they had eliminated the game of Monopoly, right? Because they didn't want children to think that it was possible to have private property or to have your own business. They now thought that it would be best to start targeting their propaganda at children to focus their attention on the next generation. So children were taught that Fidel was more reliable and better than Jesus. And how to do that? Well, ice cream. In school, they would ask kindergartners to close their eyes and to pray to Jesus for ice cream. So the kids would be at their desks and they would close their eyes and they would pray aloud to Jesus and they would open up their eyes and guess what? No ice cream. And then their teachers would tell them, why don't you now pray to Fidel and ask Fidel for ice cream? And so they would all pray to Fidel, and when they opened their eyes, there was ice cream on their desks for them. And so they were able to convert an entire generation of children and subsequent generations of children by these small propaganda techniques. You may not like them, but brilliant techniques. Fidel Castro wanted to eliminate the idea that you would rely on religion or any outside source, that you only were to rely on the state and Fidel Castro as its leader. And they accomplished that in a very short period of time. Government control of all private property. It wasn't long before Castro eliminated the middle class. Anyone who had a small business, the government would show up after your door shortly after the revolution and announce to you that you had a couple of choices. The business now belonged to the government. You're welcome to stay on if you'd like. Make a small salary and continue to run. They need you. But if you decided not, you just simply lose your business and the building attached to it, and you'd have to start over someplace else. So it effectively eliminated the middle class. Castro also took over all non-Cuban-owned businesses on the island and turned private farms into communes. I'll talk tomorrow about the amount of land that was allowed per person, but they allowed effectively 993 acres per person, per family, was the amount that you were allowed. So if you were a farmer and you had tens of thousands of acres, you now only had your home and 993 acres, and the rest belonged to the government. You were welcome to farm that land and take a percentage, but at some point it became worthless for you to farm that land because they were simply going to give the rest of your land to the people who used to work on your land. So, and a similar thing that happened post-apartheid, this also in South Africa, this also happened in Cuba. So the term revolution became kind of a code for give us all of your property. And that's what most people thought. The Mariel boatlift, many of you remember this from the 1980s. From April to October, over 125,000 people got onto boats and came from Cuba to the United States. One of the terms of this agreement was that if you were going to leave, you had to have someone come up and get you. So they sent boats, government boats and private boats up to pick people up in Cuba. But that Fidel also said, if you're going to leave, we're also going to send our undesirables with you. So we cleaned out a number of his prisons and some of his mental health facilities with the undesirables and sent them on these boats to the United States. Over 125,000 Cubans reached Florida by the end of the Mariel boatlift in October. So what's life today like in Cuba? Life has been slowly changing for people since Fidel left and Raul came into power, and now we have the new president, President Diaz. Young Cubans are more talkative now. They're much more comfortable about talking about things, more open about their prospects, and they feel a little bit more comfortable today because of their connections to the outside world. The average Cuban salary still remains pretty much the same. They make about 20 cents per hour. For those of you who didn't receive much information on the government subsidies, here's a little bit of information about that. Cubans get free food allowances, so they get this little book called the libreta. And the libreta has all of their information, and so each time they go into the store, they check off the food that they're able to get for free. If you have a child, you're able to get a certain amount of milk up until the age of 8. After your child turns 8, you're no longer able to get milk, but you're able to get certain amounts of oil, of eggs, of bread, of flour, these kinds of things. And then once you've eliminated your amount, you've gone over your amount, you can then use your money that you make in your salary to buy more at the Venta Libre depot. So you actually get a certain amount of staple food every single month, and then they give you a salary that you can pay extras for. Utility bills are all very highly subsidized. Your monthly phone, electricity, and gas bill total combined is around $2 per household. So it's still, when people are talking about making only $20 a month, that's 10% of your monthly income, or 5% if you're at the higher range of $40 a month. But now, as more than 1 million, 500,000 to 1 million people are now entering the private sphere, this $2 is becoming a very easy bill for them to pay. So you'll see more people with cell phones and nicer telephones and nicer utilities, nicer ranges and stoves in their homes because they can afford it. All medical coverage is also provided free by the government. Gasoline is sold at subsidized costs. Education is completely free, even if you want to go on to get your doctorate, your specialty degrees, or if you wanted to return to school after you finish with your career, you can continue to take free classes. Alcohol, beer, and food is all sold at cost by the state. A bread roll costs less than, you can get 5 of them for 1 penny effectively. You can also get 1 egg for 1 penny. So it's very, very affordable. Here's what one of those libretas, the ration booklet, looks like. And you can buy unlimited quantities of the other foods that you want to. The only question is whether or not you're going to have enough. So there's always seems to be enough food. The problem is that you might not get exactly what you want. So, for example, in the past month or so, they've had real problems with cooking oil on the island. So there's no cooking oil available. So people want to cook using oil. There isn't any available. So now it becomes a problem with getting it on the black market. Next month they'll probably have oil, but there'll be a shortage of something else. 2 months ago they had problems with flour because the flour mills had some production problems. So there wasn't enough flour. So you really have to make sure that you know exactly what you need, and you have to buy in advance to ensure that you have enough. Rental rates are controlled, and most Cubans own their own homes. And today, that's one of the things that was reemphasized was the importance of property ownership for Cubans. Property taxes, service taxes, and goods taxes are all zero. So if you buy something for $5, it's just $5. There's no taxes on it. While Cubans are poor, they are not destitute, nor are they starving, as most of you saw. The World Health Organization rates Cuba's water as one of the best in the world, and their levels of health and life expectancy are also among the best and the highest in the world. Half of the Cuban population makes from $300 to $400 a year. Another half of the population earns from $1,000 to $2,000, and most of these people receive subsidies from their friends and family living in the United States. So $3.35 billion enters Cuba every single year from the United States in the forms of wire transfers from Western Union and other companies. People are able to send that money. Also, when people come now on an American Airlines flight from Miami to Cuba, they're able to bring in money, and this money is able to help subsidize people's lives in Cuba as well. About 500,000 are now considered among the self-employed, but actually that's now climbing closer to 1 million over the past year. The highest paid workers are the people in the tourist sector, where they receive tips. So, as we've talked about, please tip generously if you happen to go back. Final thoughts. Living in Cuba is like living in a bubble. The news is filtered and manipulated. Cubans are very connected to each other, but isolated from the rest of the world. If you live in Cuba, you have little idea of what's happening outside of Cuba. And even if you have money, you might not be able to purchase what you want or what you need. Expectations are very low, so even the smallest victory is a reason to celebrate and get out and have a party. Planning is difficult, so they don't bother planning. They just enjoy the here and now. And if you can't plan, you just enjoy the present. So when in Cuba, live like the Cubans and enjoy every single moment.